What is up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. I post photography-related videos and content every single Monday on this channel, so if you're interested in this video's topic and you'd like to see some more like it, you can hit that subscribe button or go and check out my other videos. You can also leave a like on this video if you find it interesting, and also a comment down below letting me know which photographer I should feature next. So, this week's video will be another Photographers in Focus episode. This is a series where I feature the life, works, and influences of a certain photographer. This week, I'm going to be talking about Zdzisław Beksiński, which is not a name that I'm going to say many times in this video. I hope that you cannot blame me for that. Apparently Polish is one of the most difficult languages to learn, and right off the bat, the first three letters are ZDZ. Anyway, I'm going to be calling him Beksiński, and you can just know that his first name is Zdzisław. You have probably heard of Beksiński's work as a painter. He's one of the most famous and prolific painters of the 20th century, and he painted these nightmarish dreamscapes that haunt your memory if you've ever seen one. So I'm sure if you've seen his work, you can recall it, because it really jumps out of the page at you. But you probably haven't heard of Beksiński, the photographer, and that's what I'm looking forward to talking about today. So usually for these Photographers in Focus episodes, I like to feature lesser known artists or artists who don't have the hype in modern times that they deserve, because I find it much more interesting to research them. You know, I feel like I'm kind of peeling back the layers of history and contributing to the body of knowledge by assembling obscure data about somebody instead of just rehashing info that has been brought up 1,000 times in different interviews with this famous photographer. But as famous as Beksiński is for his paintings, his photography is really overlooked. And I did actually have to do quite a bit of peeling back layers of history type research to get all of the photos that are featured in this video. There's a lot of photos here that I'm pretty sure are only like one place online, and I have found them and assembled them. I got a little bit obsessive about collecting his photography, and I also got a little bit obsessive about collecting his digital artworks. So those are images that include photographs, and so I'm kind of lumping them in with photography more than I would the painting part. So he's got paintings, he's got digital art, and he's got photographs, and all of those will be included in this video. I do fancy myself quite the archaeologist for digging up all of these images, and I hope that you can appreciate the amount of time and effort that went into this video. Again, you can leave a like down below if you're feeling up to it. That would be sweet. So anyway, with all that said, and without further ado, let's get into the life of Zdzisław Beksiński. So, he was born on the 24th of February in 1929 in a town called Sonek in southern Poland. There is a little bit of uncertainty about that date because during the German occupation of Poland, he was given a false year of birth to save him from deportation to Germany. His actual date of birth, I don't really know, I couldn't find it. I only found one source that mentioned that there was uncertainty towards it, but yeah. During the war, he attended grammar school in secret, and he had dreams of studying film abroad. His father did not approve of this plan to be a filmmaker though, because he wanted his son to follow a vocation that had a more stable and secure financial future. Beksiński's childhood and most of his formative years as a young teen were spent during the Second World War, and all of the years leading up to it, which also were rife with political instability. No idea what that's like. And growing up in that environment, I can imagine, had quite the impact on his psyche. It would have absolutely been traumatic. And we'll talk a bit about the influences of that trauma in his work a little bit later on. But his later years as a young adult were spent after the war during the Soviet control of Poland. So the Soviets occupied Poland during the Second World War, and Germany and the Soviets kind of used Poland as a battleground. The country was razed, basically, and then after the Second World War, the Soviets took control of the government and rebuilt the country. It was a period that was marked by urbanization and industrialization for Poland, but also by authoritarianism and social control. So Beksiński's father insisted that he attend university for something that would guarantee a financially stable future for him. And so he entered the Faculty of Architecture at Krakow Polytechnic in 1947. He hated architecture though, he hated this discipline, and he said once, "I hated architecture so much that architecture is a plan, a project, and as boring as a mechanical saw execution." So I think that's kind of a weird translation, but you kind of get the gist. He hates architecture. His study of architecture, however, did endow him with the fine motor control that he would need, because they made drafts, right? They were drafting all of these, I don't know what's involved in architecture, but lots of drafting apparently. And in doing those, he would develop a taste for fine lines and the ability to control his hand in very fine ways. And those skills would go on to serve him later in life when he took up drawing and painting. It also helped him learn the symbolism and history behind certain architectural styles that would later be incorporated into his works. So there is a really heavy focus on architecture throughout both his paintings and his photography. I will talk about those a little bit later, but it's really interesting to note. During his time at university, on August 30th of 1951, he married his wife, Zofia Helena Stankiewicz, who would remain his wife until her death in 1998 after 47 years of marriage. Beksiński finished his studies in 1952 as a graduate of the Faculty of Architecture, and he was obliged to take up a mandatory job assignment, which was required by the Soviet-controlled government at the time. So the mandatory job assignment that he took up was a construction site supervisor. He worked there for several years, and he utterly hated it. Every source I read on him mentions how much he hated being a construction site supervisor. But during this time, working as a construction site supervisor, he did start to experiment with photography. And he also started experimenting with sculpting and painting and drawing. He was extremely meticulous, and he would create these massive, extremely detailed drawings. But he would also create sculptures using materials that he found at the construction site where he worked. In 1955, he returned to his hometown of Sanok and spent a few years working there at the Autosan, which was a Polish bus manufacturing company. He bought brushes and paints from the Autosan and began to take painting more seriously at this time, experimenting with oil paints and making sure that he had higher quality materials. In 1957, so 2 years after he started working at the Autosan, he set up an informal group of art photographers in Poland, and their expeditions were held in various galleries across the country. In 1958, he actually began to gain critical praise for his photography because it was very cool and very groundbreaking, and he was able to become a member of the Association of Polish Art Photographers. In 1959, he and two of his friends exhibited their first exhibition abroad, which was in a prestigious art gallery in Cologne, Germany. The photography that he did in his early life is definitely a precursor and very much foreshadows the paintings that he would make later on. And I do think it's really interesting to look at how one preceded the other, so keep that in mind as you see some of the examples in this video. His first and only child was born on November 26th of 1958, and it was a bouncing baby boy named Thomas. The boy would go on to later become a well-known journalist and radio music presenter in Poland, so kudos, Thomas. But unfortunately, in 1959, after a regrettably short career as a photographer, Beksiński stopped working as an art photographer and donated all of his photographs to the Sanok Museum, stating that he had nothing more to communicate through the art form. He also gave up working at the bus manufacturer and began to devote all of his time to art, specifically to painting and drawing. So he created a bunch in this period, and then in the late 1960s he entered into what he calls his fantastic period, and that lasted until the mid-80s, and that's when he created the vast bulk of his works. His works that he created in that period were like, you know, some of the most famous painting, not the most famous paintings of the 20th century, but like definitely some of the more well-known ones. If you see this painting, you've probably seen this painting before. You've probably seen this painting before. You know, he created a lot of incredible and terrifying works with very haunting imagery and symbolism. In 1972, he exhibited a collection of his paintings featuring dismal figures and creations with more surrealism than abstraction. In 1977, he moved from his hometown of Sanok to Warsaw, where he lived in a third-floor apartment in the industrial district. And now this is a 4-bedroom apartment, and he was living with his wife and both of their elderly mothers, and I actually don't know if he's living with his kid as well, but like, that's a lot of people in an apartment, and every source that I've found that talks about this apartment calls it cramped, and I do understand why it would have been cramped with that number of people. He did have the largest room in the apartment made into his studio, but it was still too small for him to adequately like varnish large-scale paintings and finalize them, so yeah, there was some restrictions. He also did this super dramatic thing right before leaving Sanok for Warsaw, where he made a huge bonfire in his backyard and he just burnt all of the paintings that he didn't want to take with him. So there's a ton of lost art out there. It's not out there, it's in the sky, it's been burnt. But at one point, there was a ton of his paintings that existed, and he said that a lot of them were like, you know, not quite there, it didn't inspire him, but he also said that some of them were too personal, which I find very interesting, Over the next 30 years, he created all of his artworks in this cramped studio. He did not move. In 1984, he established contact with a Parisian art dealer who was really enthused about his art and was like, hey, we're gonna make you big. We're gonna exhibit you in France and in Germany. We're gonna do all this stuff. But Beksiński was like, no, like you can do that. I'm just gonna paint. He was like not into self-promotion at all, apparently. And in the early 1990s, the Sanok Historical Museum launched a publicity campaign for his works that arranged over 40 exhibitions across Poland. And he apparently didn't attend any of them. He didn't ever attend any of these art events, and he was actually very withdrawn. His first permanent gallery was set up in Sanok Castle, and it contained about 100 of his pieces. In 1994, he ended contact with the Parisian art dealer who was all gung-ho about promoting him, and he deferred all business to the Sanok Historical Museum. So they were like his official method of disseminating his works to the world, apparently. Also in the 1990s, he started working with photo manipulation and digital art. And I don't know if you guys watched my history of photo retouching video, I go a little bit into the history of Photoshop and how a lot of these like early photo manipulations were taken on film and then scanned into Photoshop and then manipulated there, and that's how his photos were. So he would take photos and then scan them in. These are not digital images originally, and then he would manipulate them using digital tools. He would also scan his drawings in and manipulate those using digital tools, and that created some really interesting looks as well. So yeah, lots of cool stuff going on there. In 1995, his wife, Zofina, was unfortunately diagnosed with an aortic aneurysm, which precipitated her death in 1998, 3 years later. And then, after she died, the following year, on Christmas Eve, in 1999, Beksiński's son, Thomas, commits suicide by drug overdose, and Beksiński was the one who discovered the body. So that was a pretty intense couple of years for him, as you can imagine. In the following years, he devoted all of his time to painting and digital art, and although friends would visit him from time to time and check up on him, there was nobody in his life that could really fill the void that was left by his wife and son, and he was mostly just a recluse the rest of his life. On February 21st of 2005, Beksiński died, and get this, it's wild how he died, okay? You'd think it'd be like, oh, he's got a heart attack or something. No, he was stabbed to death. He was stabbed 17 times. Why? It wasn't anything to do with him being a painter. It was absolutely nothing to do with his art career or his notoriety, nothing. It was his landlord's teenage son who wanted to borrow money from him, like a couple $100 worth of zloty, which is the Polish currency at the time. A couple $100, and he said no, and then the teenager stabbed him 17 times and murdered him. Like, what a bizarre way for this guy to leave the planet. Like, it's just so dumb. It's such a dumb reason to die. It's such a dumb reason to kill somebody. Anyway, so that was really dumb. He died for a really dumb reason, although his funeral was very well attended by hundreds of people, apparently, and all of his works after his death were donated to the Sanok Museum. So they now have the largest collection of his works anywhere on the planet, which is cool, and they exhibit them around Poland from time to time and around the world, I suspect. Yeah, and thus ended his decades-long career as a photographer, sculptor, and most famously a painter, known as the Nightmare Artist. Yeah, crazy life. So let's talk about the Nightmare Artist. So, throughout his career, he claimed that there was no symbolism to anything that he painted. And he said once, "It misses the point to ask me what the scenes in my paintings mean. Simply, I do not know myself. Moreover, I have no interest in knowing." He has also said, "If I had something to say, I would write it down or say it. I don't need painting for that." I don't know, he's being a little bit coy, in my opinion. Because look at his paintings, like, tell me there's no meaning in this. A lot of different, like, news outlets and stuff call him the Nightmare Artist or Painter of Dreams, blah, blah, blah. But he's also said that all opinions that I allegedly paint dreams come from journalists. In my life, maybe I've tried to paint one dream, a fragment from a dream in my early youth. So he wasn't actually painting dreams. He wasn't. And I believe that, because I think that you can synthesize these concepts without the use of the subconscious. Call me crazy. Every work by Beksiński is untitled, and he didn't like the concept of titling his artwork because he was worried that it would impose meaning on his painting that would then be picked up on by the viewer, and he just wanted to create interesting paintings that could be viewed as interesting paintings. But interestingly, his photographs do have titles, which I think maybe says something about how he saw each medium. It is interesting that he has so often reiterated that he doesn't want his paintings interpreted or combed for meaning when they are so ripe for interpretation. There is so much apparent symbolism within them. A bit of a tangent here, but his paintings are so odd that they remind me of this like AI-generated art. I'm sure you guys have seen it, but the AI-generated art is created by feeding a computer many different images and having it synthesize something that has resemblance to all of those images or bears similar features. And if human creativity follows from a similar process, which I suspect it does, then it is not hard to interpret Beksiński's work as the amalgamations of the images that he was fed throughout his life, specifically the images of World War II and the post-war occupation of his country, as being war and suffering and starvation, destruction during the Second World War, and then authoritarianism, oppression, and social control after the war. All of these concepts come through full force in his paintings. These themes are so prominent in his work that it is impossible to look at any of his paintings and not see some of the elements being interpreted into them. And I suspect, I'm editorializing here, but I suspect this irked him so much because as much as he wanted to create paintings that stood alone as paintings, he was perpetually creating abstracted relics of that particular moment in history that he had witnessed, and with it, of his own personal trauma that he carried with him. And so he says, don't look for meaning in my paintings, and it's kind of like he's saying, don't look at the trauma that produced these paintings, just look at them as paintings, and don't think too much about it. But something else that is interesting, and we're gonna start talking about photography now, is that these themes of war and violence and starvation and destruction and social control are not so evident in his photography. And I suspect that one of the reasons why he grew tired so quickly of the art form is because it did restrict him. Because it's hard to create photographs that give the impression of war or the feeling of war without being so on the nose as to capture burned out buildings or soldiers or tanks. And all of those elements, those easily photographed elements that do convey the feeling of war, had retreated into the past by the time he was photographing things. They had been replaced by Soviet-era concrete buildings and the illusion of regularity and daily life. So to convey the feelings of war and destruction that obviously haunted him, he needed to find a different medium. Photography wasn't going to cut it because it's confined to what can be photographed. And that feeling is not something that can be photographed, but it is something apparently that can be painted. Going back to the AI thing, you cannot have an artificial intelligence program generate a photograph. You can have it generate something that looks like a photograph, but it's not going to be a photograph, right? And so all of these like images and things, you want to like combine them into something that bears resemblance of all of them. That is not something that you can do through photography. It is something you can do through digital art though, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah, I thought that was very interesting. I thought he had a very interesting psyche as an artist. And speaking of his psyche as an artist, he's also said to have suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder, which plagued him his entire life. And he once said, "My life is dominated by a neurotic diarrhea, and that's it. Hence my reluctance to travel, and it remains indifferent whether the journey concerns a deportation to Siberia or a yacht trip around the world. Everything that separates me from the base, which is a house or apartment that I own, exposes me to a specific conditioned nervous tension." That's probably part of why he never went to any exhibitions, and he spent pretty much his entire life as a painter working in the exact same studio in his apartment in Warsaw. Okay, let's talk about influences and key themes. Early on in his photography career, it seems like he dabbled in just regular portraiture. There's a lot of pictures that he's taken that are just kind of pictures of people. But there's always kind of a twist to them, and I appreciate that about his work. I suspect that this twist was sort of his way of experimenting with lomography. So there's a few photos that are intentionally blurred or taken in ways that obscure the subject, but keep in mind that these photos were taken in the 1950s, and the technology at the time was far superior and could have given him much more technically accurate results than what he was getting. So he was playing around with lomography. And lomography is still a beloved way of creating images. It's an art form that kind of leans into the technical imperfections of a camera or a mode of taking a picture. So there's all kinds of like novelty films and stuff. I've talked about all this on my channel before. They're all ways of playing around with lomography. The dominant current of photography at the time when he was creating, however, was that of pure photography, which emphasized the rawness of everyday life and photography's ability to capture these candid moments. So it was the practice of capturing light in the field with as much fidelity as possible. This pure photography rejected posed, stylized works in favor of candid, or ostensibly candid, raw images, and Beksiński's work completely disrupted that rejection. His work was criticized for the disruption of the subject on part of the photographer, saying that the artist was putting too much art into the photograph and not treating it simply as a photograph. And his art was also called anti-photography, because he wasn't really photographing the subject, he was not photographing the subject, but somehow pointing the camera at the subject and taking a picture. It's a very different idea of what photography is or what it means to be a photographer than we have now. In response to this anti-photography claim, he published an essay titled "The Crisis in Photography and Perspectives to Overcome It." And I cannot for the life of me find a PDF copy of this article. I swear it existed, because apparently it was extremely influential at the time. I can't find it, I don't know. But in it, I did find some quotes from it, and in it, he says, photography, like other mediums, should be experimented with and should be abstracted. And after publishing this essay, he exhibited his works in Globus in what became known as the anti-photography, which is a cool name for an exhibit. Hi, okay, sorry, another lighting change. My camera battery died and I had to recharge it, and I waited like 2 hours, and now it's dark, so sorry. So let's talk about some recurrent elements that I have noticed in his work. So his photography has the tendency to be cropped in very unusual ways. Sometimes it'll depict the subject like straight on, they're the focus, but sometimes the subject will be like way off on one side of the frame and cropped in a way that like tells you not to look at them, and yet your eye is still drawn to them because they're a person and therefore the subject in the frame. Oftentimes they'll have like these repetitive geometric patterns receding on most of the photograph, and then just a very tiny little hint of person coming in at the bottom, at the top, or whatever. And it creates this interesting like push and pull effect where you're being pushed not to look at the person, and yet your eyes are pulled towards the person because they are staring back at you or something, right? I thought that's cool. His photographs are obvious predecessors to his paintings. So this one, called the Sadist's Corset, is a body entangled in a mesh of geometrically wrapped strings, and it is very reminiscent of these later paintings that include bodies with score marks or contortions that really mimic the Sadist's Corset. He also has all of these pictures of just bodies in weird ways. Like his way of kind of abstracting the body is very interesting in his photography and definitely like shines through in his paintings. So you can see like here are some comparisons of abstracted bodies with the paintings that he's made. He also tends to partition the body and the face into its constituent elements rather than display it as one full thing. Like very rarely will you see in his work just like a regular human form. It's always got some kind of partitioning or segmentation to it, and in a lot of his portraits you'll see he's partitioned the face quite a bit. So he'll photograph something through broken glass or by casting shadows on it in interesting ways, or reflections or some variation, and that causes this like weird sort of distortion where it's not a complete human face, but it's made up of the elements that make up a complete human face, you know what I mean? And that comes through in his paintings as well. Like very rarely in his paintings will he just like draw a person's face. Like usually it'll be abstracted in some way. And I noticed in particular, looking at a lot of his photography, the eyes are missing, so they'll be so heavily shadowed that you can't see them, or there's some other disruption to the image that prevents you from being able to see the subject's eyes. In his paintings also, eyes are frequently missing. When I see this in amateur painters' work, I think it's probably because they don't know how to draw eyes symmetrically, but like it was missing in his photography before he took up painting, so I think that's more of an intentional thing on behalf of the artist. Because like, I mean, he knows how to draw eyes, we know that. He's actually, they're kind of weird sometimes when he draws them, but we know that he can. Other times, though, in his photography, he will include the eyes in a way that draws all of the attention towards them. So they're never like a neutral thing in his photography. It's always either they're not there or they are the center of attention. This one is kind of a blur between the two, in my opinion, because you're looking at the eyes, that's the subject of the frame, but also the eyes are obscured by this weird makeup that this woman is wearing. I thought that was an interesting one. Speaking of missing eyes, we also see these wrapped and bandaged faces in both his photography and his paintings. This comparison, I think, is like the most stark because you can really see what he was going for with the photo, and you can understand why he wasn't able to get it by looking at the painting. So another recurring element in his paintings is that body parts are frequently separated from the body. They're just used as like almost architectural elements. They're enmeshed with buildings or with furniture or with these large weird monuments. And that is not something that you see in his photography, I think, because I don't really know how you would do that. But you do see some examples of him like kind of experimenting with the idea of having overlapping body parts like fingers. Like in this one with the hands, you can kind of see like he's getting there. He's onto something in this photo. And another thing that you don't see a lot of in his photography is these like giant monumental architectural visions that kind of emerge from the mist and have these weird creatures mixed in with them and stuff. Those all appear in his paintings, but his photography, again, you can kind of see where he's like making strides towards that visual aesthetic, because in this picture, for example, it looks like just kind of a normal basic picture of like some mist pouring through like a roadway or whatever. But then you can also kind of see this weird like silhouette of this human-shaped thing, which I suspect is a building, but it does look shockingly like a distorted human silhouette, which was something that did recur in his painting. It is a very obvious predecessor to the kinds of works that he would go on to create with a brush. So he photographs people a bunch, but he also has the style of photography that reminds me a lot of his less detailed drawings, so his sketches, I guess. He's got this set of drawings that are just kind of like weird faces made out of like chicken wire looking lines, and then he's also got this set of photography which has this kind of style of weird abstracted squiggly lines appearing in an otherwise minimalistic background. He did a lot of like kind of weird abstract photography and played around with a lot of really cool techniques. These two photos in particular bear a resemblance. Each has a fluid black line in the middle of the image, interrupting a geographic pattern of lines in the lower half of the frame. It's a weird kind of recurring element that you don't see a lot in his paintings, but you do see in his sketches. And here are a few similarly abstracted images, and I think this one in particular foreshadows his later digital works, which very often echoed the composition in clouds in the background with a strange, undiscernible object in the foreground. People don't seem to like his later digital works, and I mean, I can kind of understand why. They're like a bit tacky by our modern sensibilities, but I think they represent a very great moment for Beksiński creatively. Finally, the technology was there that would provide him with a way to use photography to create something, not simply to capture something. The reason he abandoned photography in the first place was because he grew frustrated with the limitations of the art form, that he could only capture what existed in reality, despite any warping or visual trickery that may convince the viewer otherwise. So digital art changed that. It gave him an opportunity to use photos and photorealism in a way that could not possibly exist in reality. And I think that represents a really cool coming together of his early practice as a photographer and his mastery as a painter. It was a return to photography after decades spent away from the art form. Speaking of his digital art, in 1998, he said, "There is a certain refreshment of mind in this work, the view from a totally different perspective than a painting. Playing with these programs, I can create artificial reality at any angle and figuratively photograph it, which would be the final result of creation." So one thing about these photos that I think strikes something in me is that they've got this like low resolution, and that is not because I screenshotted them, although I did, but it's because the original images were made in a low resolution because they were made in like the 1990s and digital images back then kind of sucked. I think that there's something about that early digital age look that tweaks something in me. Like looking at them, they remind me of something in my childhood, and specifically they remind me of hours spent on creepypasta websites looking at scary images that I was convinced were true, and no matter how unrealistic they were and how poorly photoshopped they were, they still kept me up at night waiting for something like that to crawl out of my closet. That like weird terror of seeing something online that can't possibly exist in reality, and yet somebody's trying to convince you that it does. And looking at his works, I see a little bit of that. I get a little bit of that feeling, like that weird, like almost nostalgic feeling for the time in the internet when mysteries were still possible. And maybe I'm being a little bit sappy or like reading too much into it, but I do think that's part of why I like his digital work so much, because they're just weird. They're weird. Nobody would think to make something like this now because it does look tacky, and you would just ridicule it as being tacky without actually like looking into the deeper artistic meaning of it. So yeah, there's all of these weird digital art pieces that he did that bear a lot of similarity to the paintings that he had created earlier. He's really into these cruciforms that don't have a top, they just kind of look like T's, and he painted them over and over and over. When he got into digital art, he started creating digital art versions of these things. He also tends to incorporate his own face into architectural elements, monuments. This particular one of the wall like kind of turns my stomach because of the weird like fleshy droop to it, and you can just kind of imagine how it would feel to like hit that wall with a hammer and like ugh. I like that kind of weird visceral feeling to it, having the faces stretched and warped and like the eyes again missing from a lot of these is just really
weird. And the fact that it's just like a random old man who's appearing in these like weird contrived situations is like also really cool. It carries on from what he was doing with painting, because a lot of his paintings had human faces incorporated into giant monuments and things like that, like these gravestones or like this weird bell tower. And then also his digital art involved a lot of these, again, big monuments with clouds and like desolate landscapes. He made a ton of those and he painted a ton of those. So that's, again, a very obvious parallel. I've kind of said everything that I wanted to. I won't get too much into the legacy of Beksiński's paintings because he had an excellent legacy and many inspirations and stylistic themes and whatever, but those are all pertaining to his paintings, and I really wanted to focus on his photography. So talking about all the things that influenced him throughout his life after he gave up photography doesn't really make a lot of sense. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I appreciate that you watched it. I hope it was entertaining. I think it was. I had a lot of fun researching it, so hopefully you've had a lot of fun listening to me talk about it. Sorry about all the weird lighting changes and yeah. I'll see you guys again next Monday. Not sure what my video is going to be, so drop some suggestions down in the comment section. And until then, stay sharp, and don't forget to keep shooting. Bye, guys.